Welcome to the State Historical Society of Iowa and another one of our History for Lunch lectures. Let me make a couple of quick announcements. Our next lecture will be on January 10th, which is actually a Thursday. And Jim Earhart, who's been volunteering here to work with our coin and currency collection, is going to give a lecture. And believe me, there's some very interesting things for him to talk about, including a Mormon gold piece that he tells me is worth several tens of thousands of dollars. But he'll make for an interesting talk, I'm sure. We have some other talks coming up that are in partnership with the Johnson County Heritage Trust. So we're going to have Connie Mutel here on January 23rd. We're going to have another lecture sometime in February. And then since you're Amana fans, I thought I'd tell you that in March for Women's History Month, that's when Corey Deerfield will be here. She's getting a PhD from Purdue University studying women in the workforce in post-World War II Iowa. But the specific focus of this talk is going to be about the women who worked at Amana Refrigeration right after World War II. So we have some exciting talks coming up in the months ahead. We will have the Motor Mill talk in April now. That's been rescheduled. Today we're honored to have Peter Hoehnle here, who many of you know from his association with the State Historical Society. And he's going to speak about the photography of the Amana Landscape that was created by David Heusinkveld, who's in the back of the room here. And the reason we're here today is we're celebrating a brand new book out from Penfield Press, which we've laid out on the table here, called The Amana Landscape. So this is your chance to get an autographed copy. Makes a nice Christmas gift. After this program, you can speak with the author. Peter Hoehnle has a PhD from Iowa State University in history, but he began at Cornell up in Mount Vernon and actually worked here as a student intern. So we go back so many years we don't even want to account for them again. Yeah. But Peter's always doing research. He's now the executive director of the Iowa Valley Resource and Development, the last word, I forget.
Conservation and Development,
I
think.
IVRCD, I guess.
Yeah.
It's because running through the Iowa River Valley is a scenic byway that links the Amana colonies and the Meskwaki settlement, which both have lived communally for over 150 years. Peter has an upcoming article in Iowa Heritage Illustrated that you're going to want to read because he explores that relationship. It follows up on a talk he gave here a year or so ago. But we're very pleased to have Peter here because he is an Amana native and he knows this topic so well. David Heusinkveld is now retired from being a special education teacher in the Cedar Rapids Public Schools, but many of you may know of his wonderful photography and what we're going to see here today. I can't help but mention that he is the son of Joan Liffring Zugberay, who's with us here today, and we have well over 1 million of Joan's photographs here documenting Iowa from the mid-1940s up to the present. So it's really interesting for me to see this generational connection between these two photographers and what subject matter they choose. I actually wrote an epilogue for this book, and I'll try not to bore you by reading all of it, but maybe I can entice you by reading just a portion of it. This is what makes David's photography so special. Surrounding the communal village sites scattered along the Iowa River Valley is an incredibly diversified landscape comprised of broad open fields, thickly wooded areas in an almost pristine state, meandering creeks, expansive wetlands, high bluff lines, and deep ravines. Documenting these undisturbed natural areas filled with wildflowers, groves of trees, ponds, mill races, and waterways has been masterfully done with these images. The photographer's real gift is his ability to capture a world unseen by most individuals in the sense that in the 20th century, Americans failed to appreciate the natural beauty in their own backyards or spend so much time crossing country on foot. The adventuresome photographer had to track through snow, climb over fallen tree trunks on the forest floor, step lightly on muddy ground, or push aside tall grasses to find the perfect spots. Holding still and being quiet so as not to disturb an animal, all the while holding the camera steady, the creator became one with the scenery, using intuition and careful observation as his guide as to when to click the shutter. The exceptional coloring and rare beauty could only be captured through diligence and by paying acute attention to the details, whether in the distance or close at hand. The artist aptly captures the images hinting at the mood of the scene, and these magnificent photographs, the magnificent colors captured in his vistas offer perspectives that 19th century photographers could not dream of with their black and white film. So enjoy the show, and we'll have questions afterwards. Thanks for coming today.
I just want to start out by saying that nothing that I wrote in the book is remotely beautifully done as Mary's epilogue. That is the beautiful essay, very meaningful interpretation of David and his work and his place, and sort of the pantheon of Iowa photography by one of the greatest students of Iowa photographs. This book is just called The Amana Landscape. It's a fairly simple title. It is a collection of well over 80 images that were taken around the Amana colonies over a space of several years by David. And these are all natural scenes, landscapes, a lot of animals, a lot of pictures of the Lily Lake, and so on. Scenes that might be familiar to many of you living so close to the colonies. One thing that we want to stress in discussing David's work and my essays is the importance that place and space had to people in Amana. Even today, the one thing that will unify everybody in a community like ours is any threat to the woodlands or the natural areas. They are deemed virtually sacred and are certainly very memory-laden places for our people. The woodlands, the fields, and the river, after all, are why people came west from Germany and then New York State here to Iowa in the mid-1850s and early 1860s and established our villages. And the maintenance and stewardship of that timber and other natural resources has been so critical to the survival of the Amana community, both physically and spiritually. So we have a series of landscapes to start with. The Amana Society lands are basically the boundaries of what we're considering Amana Landscape for the purposes of David's work and my essays. And it's approximately 26,000 acres on both sides of the Iowa River Valley, about 25 miles 20 miles due east of us, west of us. See, bad, I'm talking about a landscape book and I can't tell direction. That way, 20 miles on the Iowa River. It was originally land that was occupied by the Meskwaki Nation. The Meskwaki have an extremely strong connection to the Amana area. We now know through some recent research that a very, very important Meskwaki village was actually located very close to the site of South Amana. So this valley has been important and special to different peoples over a long period of time. It is heavily forested even today. We're thinking in the neighborhood of about 7,700 acres of timber areas, mostly on the high ridge north of the villages and then in the Iowa River bottoms. And then the rest was rolling prairie, pasture land, and field. It's oak, hickory, walnut, cherry type of a woodland. And there's some of it. Whoa. There are, of course, some man-made features, or I should say human features on this landscape. Not only the villages, but being Germans, the Amana people in the communal period had to be in control of things. Germans always have to bring order. And when you have as crooked a river as the Iowa River is crossing your land, the way to bring order to that is to dig a water canal or a mill race to divert power and to tighten it up and increase its force and volume to power the factory mill wheels. And this is actually a view over the overflow of the Amana mill race, and the mill race is that berm in the background. The mill race is 6 3/4 mile long, and it runs from West Amana down through Amana and then on to the Iowa River. It's a nice sunrise. These are the Amana Hills. One of the features of our landscape that's a little odd is that it is almost completely named. In other words, through the years, the farm workers, the villagers, attached names to different woodlands, to different hillsides, to different fields, and these names survive today, even though the farming operation nowadays is characterized by high-tech gadgetry, GPS, and so forth. They're still driving tractors over Johnson's Field or Fox's Field or up Schminke's Hill. Now, those are some of the more reasonable names. These are the ones that bear the names of the original pioneer settlers. So you have to imagine these farmers, pioneer settlers, who had settled much of the Amana land actually before the Amana people arrived in the 1850s. They sold the land, never dreaming that 150 years later they would still be remembered by their farm fields. But there is a Johnson's Field named for Rolla Johnson, was an early Iowa County settler. Fox's Field named for Alonzo Fox, and so on. There's Schminke's Hill, which is evidently named for somebody named Schminke, who had a farm north of Amana. And then there are the Pie Pieces, the Rattlesnake Hills, and so on, that are named for other features, and we'll see some of those as we go along. In front of you here, somewhat foreshortened, is the dominant landscape feature of Amana, which is the Lotus Lily Lake, which we in Amana refer to as the Lily Lake, because it's the German form translated directly into English, so it's the Lily Lake. So anytime anybody says Lily Lake, it's like fingers on a chalkboard to us. But this was a marsh area when the Amana people first arrived, and it's now a 180-acre pond. Some of the hillsides again in the snow. These pictures were obviously taken a few years ago, back when we still had snow. So if you think about, not only is David's photography a record of the landscape in Amana, but it's also a record of snow for future generations. Some of that rolling landscape. This is actually on Amana property, of course, the vanishing windmills that you see so few of these days out in the Iowa countryside. And a nice view of the sun breaking through the clouds. This again is taken looking towards Middle Amana. The water tower is the one associated with Amana refrigeration, actually, which Mary mentioned. This is an interesting shot. It's taken looking down what we refer to as the Katzebogel, or the Cat's Back Hill in Amana. It's actually near South Amana. And this is the greatest sledding hill there is. We went up this when we were kids. But it's looking down into the valley, and actually off in the distance is the site of the Patterson Trading Post in that Meskwaki village I mentioned earlier. So it's quite a historic area. This was originally, this land, or a good portion of this land, was part of an over 600-acre parcel that the federal government had broken and plowed for the Meskwaki in an attempt to encourage them to farm like Europeans. The Lily Lake in the foreground. Growing up, occasionally visitors I know would ask me what we had growing in that field because that is so thickly covered with vegetation. And there's a funny thing about the lilies. As I mentioned, that was originally a marsh when settlement occurred. And then sometime before 1874, it was the first time it shows up on a dated map, it flooded and became a pond. And that was probably not intentional. They had taken the mill race through there on its way from Middle Amana to Amana, and it likely just raised the water table so much in that adjacent marsh that it became a pond. What is interesting is it's covered with American white lotus lilies, Nelumbo lutea. That's a handy piece of Latin to bring out to impress people. Anyway, It's the only Latin I know. And it's Nilambalutea is the pale yellow American lotus lily. It's actually native to Iowa, but you really just find it in the backwaters and the oxbows off of the Mississippi. It's not really native to the interior of the state. It has to have been planted. We know that from a botanical perspective, that lily will not grow unless it has standing water to support it. And so it's not that the seed was there growing in the marsh. So somebody brought that in and planted it. But it has interesting cultural connections because in Amana, the image of the lily, of course, is all over the place. And when people were young, they used to sell these by the roadside to unsuspecting tourists. Even back into the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, I've actually read oral history transcripts where they talk about literally running out in front of cars, flagging them down, and making them buy lilies. It's shades of the mafia. But it also was culturally significant to the Meskwaki. The Meskwaki people would come and camp by Amana in usually September, October in the fall, and they would harvest the tubers that were at the base of these lilies, which are like a potato. They look a little, they're a little long, but they've got a lot of starch in them, and they would be sliced and strung up on hemlock and dried and used all during the winter. You can also eat the seeds if you roast them. Many, many cattle in the Amana area. As part of the Amana Society herd, they raise out 4,000 head of cattle a year. Right now, some of the products of those cattle are used in a methane digester. In other words, the cow poop is taken there and mixed with certain substrates, and it actually has a chemical reaction that produces methane gas, which is then used to run very large generators. So most of our electricity originates as cow pies, in one sense. This is by East Amana. Of course, the ubiquitous round hay bales that you always see in the Iowa fields these days. This is Pampas grass. This is just a nice, very almost an abstract photo that he took. It's actually not native to Iowa. This is a variety that's brought in as an ornamental. And you'll see that for the most part, the pictures that are in David's work are of natural things. And you will not really see people in any of these pictures unless you bring out a magnifying glass and look in the cab of a tractor or whatnot. But in this case, we are at the East Amana Cemetery, which commands a beautiful view of the Iowa River Valley. Like all of the Amana cemeteries, fenced with rows of evergreen trees. Evergreens, keeping their needles, of course, all during the winter, are a symbol of eternal life. And from a Christian perspective, very appropriate to a graveyard. And the folks in the Amana community are buried in chronological order of death. So you're in the next available spot, and it may be near a relative, or it may be near that neighbor you couldn't stand. But the idea is that we're all alike and all equal in life as in death, even though we may forget that sometimes. So that is and the stones typically have the name and the day the person died on them, and sometimes their age. More cattle. This is East Amana Cattle Call. And this is one of the award-winning photos. This won the Keeping Iowa Beautiful Award, first place. And this is a little farm cattle watering pond by East Amana. And it's also the cover of the book. It's a view of some timber and, of course, the clouds casting a shadow over fields by Homestead. Some more of the beef cows. Crowded Herd is the title for that. This one's called Mo, Larry, and Curly. he likes to give whimsical titles to some of his work. Interesting view here, of course, cornfields north of Amana, and of course, corn production very important in Amana historically. In fact, they actually had a contract with the Hybrid Seed Corn Company, which later became Pioneer, to plant test plots in 1928, which is about 2 years after the company was started. And Henry Wallace had a almost unhealthy fixation on Amana for many years thereafter, and would write us letters telling us how we could reform practices in the Amana community, including one time he suggested that we all become vegetarians. These, of course, is a romantic picture of kissing corn. And this is a fall picture, and I'm actually told by a farmer friend that the color here is very pretty, but that actually is a diseased stalk of corn. And this is another one of the very few pictures where you'll actually see a person on the landscape, but it's a kind of a reminder here. You've got the natural timber, pasture, and then the cornfield. Despite obviously having a lot of farmland, arable land, the Amana folks have always maintained a very, very large timber, as I mentioned, 7,700 acres. And in fact, especially on the northern edge, if you look at an aerial photograph of Iowa County, you can see the boundary of the Amana Society land because it literally follows the timber line. Some blackbirds. This is looking down from the Amana Hills towards the lake and the village of Amana. I think middle, right? Yes. Okay, good. Zigzag fence there in the early winter. This is a beautiful picture of the Lily Lake at the Lily Lake. Yes, the Lily Lake's much smaller in the fall. This is the mill race in the time of sunset, and this is actually one of many pictures that you'll see that are taken on what we refer to as the Hoehnle Trail, which is a mostly paved 3.8 mile trail that goes around the lake. It starts in Amana, goes around the lake, and actually has a little spur that goes up into middle Amana as well. And at one point on that trail, you literally are walking on the berm that separates the mill race on the one side and the lake on the other. So it does have its dramatic points. Again, another view of the mill race. Of course, the mill race, although totally human-made, often features in descriptions of Amana, and that my favorite are Bertha Shamba, who in 1908 would write these accounts about the Amana community as though it were a garden, and that led me to appropriate Paul Marx's term of machine in the garden, and this idea of the bucolic community, all the flower gardens, the climbing tree vines. And then the mill race, overhung with willow trees and climbing pickerel weeds, she writes about. Then she goes on to downplay the fact that mill race is there to supply water power to a factory that produces thousands and thousands of yards of woolens and is actually the largest textile mill in the state of Iowa. So there's that interesting dichotomy of the way that people in Amana have both embraced nature and tried to shape it. Another mill race. We do prescribed burns. Prescribed burning first really came into vogue in the early 1970s. Paul Christensen at Cornell College, just have to get a little plug in there, was a very, very early proponent of that. In pre-settlement days, there were regular fires that swept the Iowa prairie and swept through the woodlands. In the case of the prairie, that kept down the encroachment of trees. It also literally would warm the soil in the spring, if it was a spring fire. It would also remove the thatch. It made it very easy to travel across the prairies. When it went through the woodlands, it would usually burn the ground cover and make it very easy to travel in the woodlands. Thus, we believe, or some of us do anyway, that those fires were probably intentionally set by Native Americans. They used to always say that they were caused by lightning strikes, but that doesn't happen that often, as far I don't think. Mill race. The Iowa River. This is actually probably the straightest segment of the Iowa River there is. The Iowa River, of course, 363 miles long from the Mississippi all the way up into Hamilton County, and it is the stream from which the state of Iowa takes its name. When Albert Lee wrote his notes on the Iowa Territory, he talked about the Iowa River flowing through it and that it had given its name to the territory. At least it did when he said so. It is named, of course, for the Iowa tribe that was very prevalent in the area before settlement and the Meskwaki came. These are some ice flows on a stretch of the river. This is actually an unusual area. This is from the Highway 151 bridge looking west. On the left, you can see the river bluffs. They're very, very high palisades on the one side of the river. Other than that, the Iowa River Valley is extremely flat. Where it flows through Amana, there's this expanse of about 2 to 3 miles of very, very flat land and then abruptly bluffs at both ends. So it kind of gives a little hidden valley effect there, if you will. The river again in winter. Of course, beavers do their work. I don't think that tree's doing too well. And that is a beaver skull, and yes, that is the natural color of those teeth. More beaver work. This is a little herd of deer. Of course, as we mentioned in the essay on wildlife, deer were basically extirpated. They were gone from the state of Iowa by 1900. So the deer you see now are a mishmash of deer wandering in from other states, but more importantly, they're deer that were just reintroduced by humans. There were no deer during much of the Amana communal era. In fact, we actually have newspaper notices from like the 1950s in the local Little Amana paper where they would print, well, you know, they were a little hard up for news, and there would be these items like, last Thursday, driving between West and High Amana, Dave Krause saw 3 deer together in the field. So you can imagine what a headline there would have been for this photograph. But of course, they've more than come back. In fact, there are, depending on your perspective, this gets a little controversial, but there are a lot of deer. And from the perspective of somebody who likes to see young trees grow, it is a little bit of a problem with maintaining the forest. From the perspective of the hunting community, of course, our deer herd is too small. More deer. An opossum, of course, extremely ancient animal. It's been around, very, very primitive mammal. Bald eagles. Never saw these historically in the Amana area. That's been a real treat in more recent years as they've come up from the Mississippi River along the streams into the interior of the state. And one year when the lake was particularly low, there were 30 or more of these eagles feasting on carp that were laying out in the lake bed at that time. Another species, of course, very famously on the endangered species list that's made a dramatic comeback. Nice fall scene. This is, again, I believe, Price Creek. There are several little creeks and streams that flow across the property. They all have names. There's, for example, the Mill Ditch by West Amana, so-called because it went by a flour mill. The Oxaclabe, or the Ox Ditch by High Amana, so-called because of some association with oxen, who knows. And then Price Creek. And Price Creek is a little stream that's about 13 miles long, and it curls along the north edge of the Amana property and then past Maine, Amana, and it is named for Abraham Price, who was a squatter there in 1845, 1846. And his name is also preserved in the record. This is a little pool in the timber. And here we get into the lake pictures, you can see. This picture we included because of the juxtaposition of the Amana refrigeration industrial site with the Lily Lake. And there seem to be, at least in my memory, more lilies now than there ever were before. I was once approached by somebody who talked about the arrow plant, which you'll see some of in these pictures, and how it was overtaking the lilies a little bit at the edges. And we had to tell him, you know, the arrow plant is actually the native to this area. It's the lilies that are the invasive species. But they're nice invasive species. And again, as I mentioned, the seed pod, when that dries out and expands, you could actually roast and eat those seeds if you wanted to. And I invite any of you who are brave enough to wade through the muck in the bottom of the lake to do so. 2 lilies. It's a beautiful shot here of the inside of a very perfect lotus. Some milkweed and a lotus blossom. There are some unusual animals as well. These are box turtles. I think they're related. Beavers and muskrats. This time of year and getting into winter, you'll see a lot of little muskrat houses on the lake, all made out of lily stems. And then the pictures that are really my favorite from the book, he's really captured some unusual pictures of these leaves of the lily plants. And as they change, as they dry, as you get into the fall, and the almost iridescent colors. I mean, they look a little bit like Tiffany Favril glass in some ways. And that's another point I want to make with David's photography. He is really has an unusual sense with his work. In other words, he will often take pictures of things that you wouldn't think to take a picture of, or you might pass by. His mother made that comment to me when we were doing some of the sorting of the pictures, that she said, I would never have thought to take that picture, but he did, and it's marvelous. Branches and leaves and even a half-dried leaf of a lily plant, bullfrog, dragonfly. That's a snake, as if you didn't know. And these, I believe, are wood ducks, female wood ducks. And then this is one of our controversial muskrats. We went around and around about muskrats versus beavers, but this is a muskrat because I say it is. There's a nice series in David's work and also in the book of ice and the different shapes. This one's called ice goblets. There's some broken ice here, sidewalk ice, some pocked ice. It's a picture of the Kulnevik Trail. This was in the Cedar Rapids Gazette. He's been featured in the Press Citizen, in the Cedar Rapids Gazette. Did a well-received two-person show at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art 2 years ago with his mother, which was very, very interesting to see kind of a juxtaposition of mother and son and the very different approach that both take to photographing nature. And there'll be some pictures coming up that were in a recent issue of Outdoor Iowa magazine. The lake at Sunset. This one is very appropriately called Lily Lake Fire. It's an inlet of the Lily Lake. Actually pretty much the same area in winter. And then we get into the geese. The dramatic picture of the Canada geese flying directly overhead. There are Canada geese, there are pelicans, there are bald eagles and wood ducks and trumpeter swans, among other birds on the lake. Believe it or not, you would think with a highway on the north of it and then basically housing development surrounding it, the Lily Lake actually has a lot of botanical and natural integrity. We had a plant survey done of it 10 years ago, and they found 217 different distinct species of plants in this little rim of natural area surrounding the lake. We've got the very happy trumpeter swans. This one is the called fair warning because they actually attacked the photographer. They didn't appreciate the paparazzi. And then the odd goose out. You notice the goose there with the pelicans, and those are pelicans. And these are trumpeter swans. You can notice the band on the one here, the neck band. And trumpeter swan, again, is the largest of all native water birds. Again, very, very rare in Iowa. Very successful program has brought them back to selected areas. One of them was the little wetland by High Amana. And so we have this pair of trumpeter swans. They've raised many cygnets, and it's been a very successful program. Row of poplar trees north of the lake. Because the Amana Society has this large block of land, they've often been very willing to house different experiments. I mentioned the Wallace brothers and hybrid corn in the 20s. This is a stand of poplar trees that a grad student at the university here planted 20 years ago. The idea of showing how they were taking chemicals and such out of the groundwater before it made its way into the creek. And some mist in the hills. And that is a cardinal. We have a few beautiful bird pictures here. Or maybe we don't. Okay, that is a robin on the fence. I think he's got a name for that, but I'm not sure. Bike Trail Luncheon, this one's called. This is a fritillary butterfly on Joe Pieweed, which I encourage you all to say 10 times fast. It's again a native Iowa prairie plant. And of course, the Monarch on the Bluebells, which is a photo that, one of his best known photos. And I think you know exactly where this picture was taken too, which I think is remarkable, because we were looking at a picture one time, he said, that's about where I took the butterfly blues. Swallowtail, spring crocus, or croci, I guess you call them. This one is titled Charlie's Angels. This is a case of non-native plants, but they are my dad's. And so David went over and took pictures of my father's crocuses this spring, and we included that in the book. And then this is the castor bean, a seed pod of a castor bean head. Again, another ornamental. Peony and the tiger lily. A very nice March sunset. And that brings us to the close. I just want to make a few more comments. David really came to photography a little later in life, after a very bad car wreck that took the life of his son Jordan about 10 years ago. And this has been kind of a therapy for him. And it was literally the gift of a camera from his mother that started him along this route. He's had many people help him as he's gone along and taken these pictures and assisted him with the technical aspects. But it's been a true therapy. It's been a true way too for him to find his own voice. And as a friend of mine said, you know, what a gift to any parent or spouse to help their loved one meet their fullest potential. And I think he certainly has in the work that he's accomplished. Now, just another word about the book. There are essays in it on different topics. We did one on woodlands, one on, I think on the lake, one on the mill race, and so on, kind of placing them in historical and natural context, both in Iowa and then also in the case of the Amana community. People in Amana are always walking in the woods, sometimes killing things, sometimes just there to enjoy nature. And there's a religious quality to it for them. They have a deep love, especially of trees, as is evidenced by these very large pine groves that were planted. And those of you who are fortunate enough to remember the Tannaval at South Amana, which is now so heavily damaged, or even the great pine grove at Amana, will remember they were almost church-like when you would walk in there, like these giant, very tall, large trees and pine trees, like the beams of a cathedral. And certainly the reaction that elicited in the local folks was on a spiritual plane. The land is almost like a person to us on some level. And although sometimes it may not have been treated to the best environmental standards that we today would have liked, still there has been a long time sense of stewardship, and as is true of many of our farming friends in Iowa, sense that we are just passing through and sending this on to the next generation. And of course, it is wonderful that David Heusinkveld has been able to capture this particular moment in that transitioning landscape for the future. Thank you.
Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask Peter?
Oh dear.
I was taken. Is it on? I was taken by the fact that all of the places are named the way they are in Europe and the way they typically aren't here. And it's always, I've always wondered why there aren't more places that have place names, and was really pleased to hear you say that that's happening in Amana. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that, why it's not more widespread?
Well, I think, you know, in any community you've got some identifying names, and maybe I'm just more aware of it having lived there and the fact that we've actually mapped these. But it gets down to the ridiculous. I mean, every little ditch that has water in it has a name, and there's some names that the farm crew apply to, you know, just tiny little fields that memorialize not only early settlers but like where the sawmill was and that sort of thing. I don't know if it's just that that's gotten passed down because it's been the long occupants of one group of people, but yeah, I don't know. It just seems extreme in our area. Yes, sir?
It seems particularly odd to me that you would name fields after a particular person when you have communal ownership of the land.
They're not named after members of the society, but they're named after the people from whom it was bought. So it was Whiting's farm, it was Johnson's farm, and that was just the way they identified them from the beginning. You know, let's go down and plow in Whiting's today, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I agree. It's pretty weird. And the other thing that's kind of funny is I'm not really sure that people in Amana actually know that these were the pioneer settlers. I mean, I myself only figured that out after I went back and through the wonders of a website with government land office records was able to identify, oh my gosh, there was somebody named Abraham Price, and he was at the head of that creek, and Rolla Johnson really did own all of this land that's Johnson's Field and so on. So they know the names, they don't know the story. So.
Does anybody else have a question for Peter? Can I put you on the spot, Joan, and get a reaction from you about how you feel about these photos?
Well, I find them spiritually exciting, as Peter mentioned, and no one other than Peter could have done such wonderful documentary to go with the pictures. I mean, it was just a gift to find Peter knowing so much about Amana and being able to be articulate enough to write the copy.
I think you're absolutely right, because Peter has such an affinity for his homeland. I often tell him, you come from a strange and wonderful country. It's like a little enclave that I go out to just to gain serenity. So I really think it's a beautiful place, and I really appreciate David taking the time that I don't have to go out there and wander around and just prove to all of us how beautiful it really is. So let's give David a round of applause. I would invite you to come up and browse through the book and potentially buy one. They're really quite beautiful. And other than that, I guess we're done for today. And please come speak to the author and the photographer and anyone else.
Thank you all for coming.
I want to add also that
Wonderful
only
group.
Mary Bennett could have done the epilogue, because she understands totally all the photographers that have attempted to document any aspect of the Amanas, beginning with Bertha Shambaugh in the 1900s.
And really, Fred Kent deserves a hats off to him, because as many of you know, we have thousands and thousands of color stereo slides that Fred Kent took, and a whole box of them is just on Amana. And so you can get a 3D view of going down a dirt country road in Amana, only it's 1940. It's a little bit different than 2012. So to be able to compare these two bodies of work, not to mention Joan's own lovely photographs of Amana, is really an incredible gift to Iowans. So thank you for doing that, you guys.
The remarkable thing with Fred Kent are a lot of those are transparencies and color slides. And I actually used some of them as an illustration of something else I wrote. And I have to keep telling people, you realize that that was taken in 1952. So they're just so crisp and clear, and the colors are so true yet.
And they're on Kodachrome film, so they should retain their color saturation properly. But any of you should come in a winter month and just pour over Fred Kent stereo slides. It's a real treat.
And our Bertha's still
She did not do a lot of landscape. The question was on Bertha Shambaugh's pictures.
She was a black and white photographer,
She was
too.
a black and white photographer.
And
she was,
technological limits placed on her meant her exposure times were rather long. So being outside with a big tripod camera and glass plate negatives, you're not going to be wandering too much into the places that David went to.
she's more a photographer of people and built environment. Yeah.
and they still exist.
Oh yes, the original plates even.
We have a question here.
I just wanted to comment that in addition to the animals and birds you've noted in your slideshow, there are a lot of others.
Oh yes.
One of the most noteworthy ones is an animal that most people don't think exists in Iowa. There are badgers on the Amana land.
Oh yes.
And we have seen them on several occasions, but most people will say, oh, we don't have badgers in Iowa. Indeed, in Amana we do.
Badgers and otters and a few bizarre things like the double cup acorn, which is a quick story on that. Shimmick, is it Hoehnle? I never say his name right. Professor Shimmick did a lot of tromping around in the Amana timber at the turn of the century, and in the herbarium that used to be here at the university, there was a sample of a double cup acorn, and that's supposed to be 300 miles south of here, that species, but he very clearly identified it as having been found in the Amana timber. We haven't seen one since. But there are some oddities like that, and again, it might just be because people like Shimmick and Chris Taliga and others have gone through that timber and just know what they're looking at, and they haven't been going through different farm timbers and so forth and seen those things. So good. Yes, sir.
Yes.
She's going to bring
used to work at the manufacturer shop in the 1970s, and I knew the guy who worked there also. He grew up in Amana when there was a society, so he knew about how it was, and he used to tell me stories about the Amanas when there was a society. And he said there was a time when the people were living together
Yeah.
and working together, on the side they would do a little bit work for people to make money. And money was unknown at that time.
Yep.
Yes. And
Who was that?
I don't remember his name.
Okay.
Yes. But he told me many stories about being a boy in the Amana colonies when they was together as a society.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.